And when you came out of this monastery, all your money was gone.
I'm good at love, I'm good at hate. It's in between.
Long before he became the gravel-voiced prophet of poetic sorrow, Leonard Cohen was a man of many contradictions, a Montreal-born intellectual who straddled the line between literature and music with an elegance that few could match. Reporters who followed his career often described him not merely as a singer-songwriter, but as a philosopher armed with a guitar, channeling ancient wisdom through haunting melodies. His career began in the world of literature, where he published several volumes of poetry and novels before turning to music at the age of 33, a late bloomer by industry standards. Yet what he lacked in youthful debut, he made up for in lyrical depth, offering songs like Suzanne, Bird on the Wire, and the universally beloved Hallelujah, which would later be covered by hundreds of artists across the globe. But beyond the accolades, Cohen was a man who saw through the glittering facade of the music industry. He was introspective, often melancholic, and almost always critical, not just of the world around him, but of himself. His interviews revealed a sharp, contemplative mind unafraid to question cultural trends, superficial fame, or the artistic integrity of those in the spotlight. To many, he was the conscience of modern songwriting, never mainstream, never chasing trends, always grounded in truth, however uncomfortable. Journalists who spent time with him often came away not with headlines, but with existential reflections, as if Cohen had turned the interview around and made them examine their own souls. Yet despite his literary and philosophical aura, Cohen was not above judgment. He had strong opinions about music, musicians, and the commodification of art, and he was never shy about expressing them, especially in private circles, or when the tape recorder was conveniently off. As reporters now reveal, some of those opinions were blisteringly honest, even brutal, and while he rarely launched public attacks, there are 6 bands that, according to several sources close to him, Cohen simply could not stand. To understand why he held such distaste for certain musicians, we must first understand Cohen himself, a man who revered authenticity above all, who saw music not as entertainment, but as sacred ritual. In a world increasingly driven by image, algorithm, and hype, Leonard Cohen stood as a lonely sentinel guarding the gate between art and industry. And when others crossed that line in a way he deemed shallow, it was enough to earn his silent yet fierce disapproval. The world of music, as reporters embedded in its backstage corridors have long observed, is far from the glamorous, soulful utopia it projects from the stage lights. For someone like Leonard Cohen, who viewed songwriting as a sacred act and believed in the spiritual essence of music, the realities behind the scenes were often jarring, if not outright revolting. The industry, by the time Cohen reached his creative peak in the late 70s and 80s, had already begun transforming into a machine driven not by message or melody, but by marketing metrics, fashion trends, and commercial clout. Record labels were no longer patrons of art. They had become investment firms hunting for fast profits and viral packaging. Talent was often secondary to image, and depth was frequently bulldozed by catchy hooks and controversy. Cohen, ever the outsider by design, witnessed the rising influence of glossy pop bands who thrived on formulas, visual gimmicks, and lyrical fluff, acts that, in his eyes, hollowed out the soul of music. This disillusionment ran deep. In private conversations documented by fellow musicians and journalists, Cohen spoke about his frustration with artists who willingly surrendered their artistic integrity for radio-friendly tunes, shallow fame, or the approval of tastemakers. He believed the stage had become more of a showroom than a temple, a place to perform personas rather than to reveal truths. Cohen, who often retreated into monasteries in periods of silence, was repulsed by the growing spectacle around music, auto-tuned vocals, choreographed rebellion, and full authenticity packaged neatly for youth demographics. These weren't just harmless shifts in taste. For Cohen, they were symptomatic of a cultural decline, where even art was no longer sacred. He mourned the loss of risk-taking, of poets with guitars, of unpolished truth-tellers who bled on stage rather than pose for photo ops. To the seasoned reporter, this friction between Cohen and the modern music landscape forms a backdrop for understanding the contempt he harbored towards certain bands. While he was rarely seen making direct public attacks, those close to him say that behind closed doors, usually with a glass of red wine in hand, Cohen was startlingly blunt. And as we'll uncover in the next segment, there were specific names that to him embodied everything wrong with the industry, bands whose success puzzled him, whose message he found hollow, or whose existence he believed undermined the spiritual potential of music. This was not mere snobbery. It was a heartfelt rejection of an art form's commodification. From the perspective of journalists who had access to Leonard Cohen in his most unfiltered moments, the animosity he felt towards certain musicians wasn't born from envy or competition. It was rooted in a profound sense of disappointment. To truly grasp why Cohen disliked some artists, one must first understand his belief that music carried the burden of truth. For Cohen, every lyric had to matter, every melody had to mean something, and every performance had to come from a place of lived experience. When he saw musicians who, in his view, treated music as a mere vehicle for fame, or worse, a tool to manipulate shallow emotions for mass consumption, it stirred not just criticism, but something close to heartbreak. Reporters often recounted his frustration with the showbizification of music, where image was polished to perfection while the soul was discarded like a rough demo. He disliked musicians who put shock value above substance, who mimicked rebellion for branding purposes but had nothing real to say, or who postures as poets while their lyrics were stitched together like marketing slogans. Cohen once allegedly remarked during an off-the-record chat, "If your words can't live on a blank page, they don't deserve a stage." This quote alone encapsulates his standard. The song had to hold its own even without the backing of beats or lights or celebrity status. He also took issue with bands that to him exploited cultural or political themes without having the personal depth to explore them. Those who name-dropped revolution or suffering as trendy accessories to sound profound without ever truly embodying those struggles. Cohen's distaste often came with silence in public but sharp wit in private. He wouldn't release diss tracks or public feuds, but he might decline to share a stage, avoid joint interviews, or quietly mock the inauthentic during backstage encounters. Journalists familiar with Cohen's inner circle noted how his criticisms weren't about genre or age. He had no bias against pop, rock, or punk inherently. Instead, he was a fierce defender of authenticity in any form. If a bubblegum pop star sang with real heart, he respected it. But if an acclaimed rock band, in his eyes, faked their angst or copied someone else's pain, they lost all credibility with him. In many ways, his dislike of certain musicians was less about hate and more about betrayal. He saw music as something holy, and when others treated it like a marketing campaign, it felt, at least to Leonard Cohen, as though they had taken something sacred and sold it cheap. In what might come as a surprise to younger generations, one of the bands that reportedly irked Leonard Cohen the most during the height of their fame was none other than the Monkees, a group widely known for their cheerful hits, television show antics, and manufactured pop appeal. To the casual observer, the Monkees were harmless entertainment, for smiling faces singing bubblegum rock that defined a portion of the 1960s. But to Leonard Cohen, whose creative foundation was steeped in literature, emotional depth, and existential inquiry, the Monkees represented everything that was wrong with the commercial evolution of popular music. Cohen never publicly attacked him in the press, but according to several insiders and journalists who spent time with him in the late 60s and early 70s, his disdain was quietly palpable. In candid discussions with fellow artists and close friends, Cohen is said to have dismissed the group as fabricated charisma, a band formed not from artistic vision but corporate convenience. The fact that the Monkees didn't originally play their own instruments or write most of their songs was for Cohen unforgivable. He viewed them not as musicians, but as actors playing musicians, a spectacle of sound designed to entertain rather than evoke. Reporters who traveled with Cohen on tour or caught him in relaxed moments backstage often recalled his dry observations about bands like the Monkees. One anecdote reveals Cohen reading a glowing magazine feature on the group and smirking, allegedly saying, "The will mistake noise for depth as long as it's well-dressed and smiling." While the Monkees did eventually fight for more creative control and evolved into more serious artists in later years, Cohen's perception of them had already solidified. To him, their early career was a betrayal to the soul of music, a Frankensteinian project by television executives seeking to capitalize on the Beatles' craze without any of the risk, rebellion, or sincerity that define real artistry. For Cohen, who agonized over every lyric and melody, seeing the Monkees topping charts and winning teenage hearts was a disheartening reminder that talent alone could not compete with branding. Journalists who documented the contrast between Cohen's painstaking songwriting and the Monkees' mass production often used the two as cultural opposites, one a poet in a monk's robe, the other a manufactured smile in paisley shirts. And while history has since been kinder to the monkeys, recognizing their later efforts toward authenticity, in the eyes of Leonard Cohen, their early rise was symbolic of a deeper cultural illness, the triumph of packaging over poetry. Among the most controversial yet consistent subjects of Leonard Cohen's private criticism was the flamboyant rock band Kiss, a group that to many symbolized freedom, rebellion, and high-octane energy, but to Cohen represented a noisy circus wrapped in makeup and marketing. While Cohen rarely engaged in public feuds or direct confrontations, music journalists who spent significant time around him during the late 70s and 80s noted his visible discomfort whenever conversation veered toward the glam rock explosion, especially when Kiss was mentioned. According to one respected Canadian critic, Cohen once shook his head during a backstage interview and muttered, "Some people paint their faces to hide. I write songs to reveal." It was a telling remark that encapsulated the spiritual and philosophical divide between the two artists. For Cohen, music was a sacred ritual, a vessel to express inner turmoil, mortality, and love's complexities. Kiss, on the other hand, with their fire-breathing performances, platform boots, and larger-than-life personas, stood for something closer to performance art, commercial grandiosity, and spectacle-driven entertainment. Reporters frequently noted Cohen's belief that bands like Kiss diluted the sacredness of rock and roll, turning it into a theatrical parade where meaning was sacrificed for marketing. He saw their empire, merchandising empires, action figures, comic books, as evidence that music had become a brand first and an art form second. During a quiet dinner in Berlin, one journalist recalled Cohen scoffing at a concert flyer plastered with John Simmons' image, remarking, "That man sells tongues better than lyrics." It was his poetic way of condemning what he saw as the prioritization of image over message. While fans of Kiss might argue that the band offered escapism and joy, Cohen, ever the realist and poet of suffering, found little virtue in escapism that masked authenticity. To him, the masks of Kiss weren't symbols of mystery, they were barriers to truth. He feared that the industry's embrace of such acts reflected a cultural shift toward distraction over introspection, entertainment over enlightenment. Cohen's inner circle often described his criticism not as bitterness, but as mourning, the sadness of watching an art form he revered become more about pyrotechnics than poetry. And though he never launched a direct lyrical attack on Kiss, his disdain was clear in the way he held tightly to silence and subtlety, while the rest of the rock world roared with smoke and mirrors. For Cohen, the issue with Kiss wasn't just a matter of taste, it was a moral divergence, a clash between art as revelation and performance as camouflage. In the pantheon of arena rock giants, few names shine as brightly as Bon Jovi, masters of the anthemic chorus, stadium sing-alongs, and feel-good nostalgia. But in the quietly brooding world of Leonard Cohen, Bon Jovi symbolized a very different phenomenon, the victory of formula over feeling, of catchy over contemplative. Reporters who followed Cohen throughout the 80s noted his growing irritation with what he often referred to as emotionally sanitized songwriting, and Bon Jovi's mega hits like Living on a Prayer and You Give Love a Bad Name often represented the worst offenders in his eyes. Though he never publicly condemned the band, multiple music journalists, particularly those covering the European circuits, recorded Cohen expressing veiled disdain for artists who relied on recycled emotional tropes. One particularly memorable moment occurred during a press dinner in Amsterdam, where Cohen, having heard a Bon Jovi song playing faintly from the kitchen radio, dryly observed, "This is music for people who fear silence." The remark, equal parts poetic and cutting, underscored his belief that true art required an embrace of discomfort, vulnerability, and imperfection, qualities he felt were airbrushed out of mainstream rock. To Cohen, Bon Jovi's brand of optimism and romanticism felt hollow, like motivational posters pasted over existential dread. Their lyrics, often built around vague heartbreak, triumphant comebacks, and simplistic notions of love and rebellion, lacked the brutal honesty and philosophical depth that Cohen labored over in his notebooks. He wasn't moved by choruses designed for radio, and he bristled at the idea that universal appeal came at the cost of lyrical integrity. According to a Rolling Stone contributor who had shared a long train ride with Cohen across France, the songwriter once remarked, "It's not enough to rhyme fire with desire. You have to burn in it." That quote, now repeated in literary retrospectives of his work, is seen by many as a subtle jab at bands like Bon Jovi, who Cohen believed played with passion but rarely from it. He viewed their success as a reflection of an audience increasingly uncomfortable with introspection, people who want to feel good, not think deeply. Though he never challenged Bon Jovi directly, his indifference to their popularity spoke volumes. To Cohen, music was never meant to uplift in superficial ways. Instead, it was meant to crack you open, force you to look inward, and leave you changed. Bon Jovi's rise marked, in his view, the rise of songs that could fill stadiums, but not silence. And for a man who built his art in the shadows of silence, that was a tragedy too loud to ignore. While ABBA remains one of the most celebrated and commercially successful pop groups in music history, not everyone was enchanted by their glimmering disco beats and sparkly stage presence, especially not Leonard Cohen. According to several reporters who followed Cohen throughout Europe in the late 70s and early 80s, the Swedish quartet represented to him a polished facade of music that masked a lack of soul. It wasn't that Cohen was immune to melody, far from it, but his idea of melody was one intertwined with melancholy, longing, and spiritual bruises. ABBA, on the other hand, seemed to Cohen like architects of escapism, songs so expertly engineered for mass appeal that they lost their humanity along the way. Journalists who managed to catch Cohen in off-the-record moments often found him contemplative, but critical of the direction pop was heading, with ABBA as a recurring example. One notable moment recalled by a German music columnist took place during a wine-fueled interview after a concert in Hamburg. When asked about the global rise of ABBA, Cohen sighed and responded, "If truth wore a sequence, maybe I'd be more impressed." Though delivered with his signature deadpan humor, the message was unmistakable. Cohen found their presentation too pristine, too removed from the raw edges of real life. He couldn't relate to music that painted the world in glitter while ignoring the grit. Where Cohen saw music as a vehicle for confession, ABBA's hits like Dancing Queen and Mamma Mia felt to him like polished performances designed to distract rather than reflect. He once reportedly compared their songwriting to perfect porcelain, beautiful, cold, and unbreakable, which, while a backhanded compliment, highlighted his discomfort with art that resisted vulnerability. Cohen wasn't opposed to joy or dance. His own work contained slivers of both, but he demanded that even joy be honest, earned through an acknowledgement of suffering. ABBA's carefully choreographed optimism, their clean harmonies and sanitized heartbreak seemed to Cohen like theater rather than therapy. For a man who wrote lines like "I'm your man" and "I ache in the places where I used to play," watching the world sway to lyrics about summer nights and kisses felt like a denial of reality. Journalists who understood Cohen's worldview noted that his rejection of ABBA was less about snobbery and more about existential values. In an age when the industry was shifting toward aesthetic perfection, Cohen clung tightly to the imperfect, the wounded, the quietly courageous. ABBA's dominance, while respected in terms of craftsmanship, to him signaled a cultural moment when style began to eclipse story, and that was a loss he grieved in silence. As U2 rose to global superstardom with their anthemic sounds and stadium-filling energy, Leonard Cohen watched from the shadows, observing, perhaps even admiring their ambition, but ultimately remaining unconvinced by their grandiose declarations and messianic image. To the public, U2 symbolized righteous rebellion, a band that merged rock with activism, performance with politics. But for Leonard Cohen, a man whose relationship with justice was forged in solitude and subtlety, the spectacle that surrounded U2 bordered on self-parody. According to several seasoned journalists who had followed Cohen's movements through the 80s and early 90s, his unease with U2 wasn't just about their music, it was about their method. He once told a French interviewer off camera, "When someone needs 100,000 people to believe what they're singing, I wonder if they ever believed it alone." The remark, later paraphrased in various biographies, struck at the heart of Cohen's artistic ethos. While Bono stood atop stages wrapped in flags and righteous fire, Cohen whispered in candlelit theaters, crafting lyrics that ached instead of roared. Reporters noted Cohen's discomfort with the halo effect that followed U2, a kind of spiritual branding that blurred the line between art and agenda. He didn't deny their talent nor their technical proficiency, but he questioned their depth. For Cohen, sincerity wasn't volume, it was vulnerability, and he feared that bands like U2 had mastered the former while avoiding the latter. During an intimate press gathering in Montreal, Cohen was asked what he thought of U2's message of global unity and peace. With a half smile, he replied, "I believe in peace, but I don't think it needs a spotlight." His words were carefully chosen, but carried a clear subtext that true change begins in silence, not slogans. While U2's lyrics aimed to uplift and mobilize, Cohen saw in them a lack of introspection, a refusal to confront the quiet personal despair that true poets must wrestle with. In contrast to Cohen's deeply confessional, even confessional to a fault lyricism, U2 often stood tall on generalizations, love, justice, elevation. Cohen, ever the skeptic of broad strokes, preferred to write about the wound itself rather than the banner above it. For those in Cohen's inner circle, his feelings towards U2 embodied a larger critique of modern rock culture, a shift from soul-searching to soul-selling, from sacred intimacy to arena performance. And while he never published an essay or gave an explosive interview denouncing U2, his avoidance of collaboration with them, despite multiple opportunities and mutual industry connections, spoke volumes. Leonard Cohen didn't hate U2 for what they were. He mourned them for what they chose not to be: quiet, bruised, uncertain, and fully human. Among the most surprising revelations from Leonard Cohen's private circles was his quiet disapproval of Coldplay, a band that, much like U2 before them, rose to prominence on the wings of hope-filled choruses, heart-tugging melodies, and mass emotional appeal. To millions, Coldplay's music was a soundtrack of youth, love, heartbreak, and spiritual yearning. But to Leonard Cohen, a man who built his lyrical legacy on the bones of brutal honesty, Coldplay represented something else entirely: the elevation of sentimentality over substance. Though never directly quoted criticizing them in public, several music journalists who had covered Cohen's late career tours in Europe recalled the subtle ways he distanced himself from what he perceived as emotional scaffolding, masquerading as poetry. One Belgian critic recounted a moment backstage in Brussels where Cohen, upon hearing Fix You playing softly over the venue speakers, simply murmured, "They want to fix you before they even know what's broken." The comment, delicate but damning, encapsulated his deeper belief that Coldplay's sonic optimism was built on a hollow foundation of over-polished sentiment. While Cohen's songs invited listeners into the wilderness of pain, loss, and existential confusion, Coldplay, in his view, handed out lanterns too soon, too brightly. Reporters noted that Cohen viewed lyrics like "Ice will guide you home," not as comforting, but as bypassing the necessary reckoning that precedes real healing. During a post-show dinner in Amsterdam, a German journalist asked Cohen about the state of modern pop rock and whether any contemporary band moved him. After a long pause, Cohen reportedly said, "I don't mind if a song gives people hope, but hope should be the reward for surviving the truth, not a product packaged at verse 2. This reflection, later paraphrased in a French culture magazine, became a quiet encapsulation of Cohen's worldview. He didn't fault Coldplay for their success. In fact, he understood why people gravitated toward it. But he deeply believed that music should not shield us from despair. It should help us walk through it. Coldplay's cinematic compositions, their dreamlike falsettos, and major chord resolutions often felt to Cohen like sonic illusions, safe spaces that avoided the real mess of being alive. He feared that such music, though well-intentioned, dulled the listener's capacity for deeper introspection. For a man who spent decades chiseling poetry from spiritual wreckage, Coldplay's ascension marked a cultural moment where vulnerability was replaced with prettiness and existential crisis was wrapped in yellow balloons. Cohen never wrote them off in anger. His disapproval was quiet, almost mournful. But for those who paid attention, it was clear. Coldplay's music to Leonard Cohen was too quick to offer the light without letting you sit long enough in the dark. Despite the clear emotional and philosophical distances Leonard Cohen kept from bands like the Monkees, Kiss, Bon Jovi, ABBA, U2, and Coldplay, one of the most striking aspects of his relationship with the broader music world was his consistent refusal to publicly humiliate or condemn any artist directly. For a man of such refined opinions and unshakable artistic principles, Cohen never indulged in sensational interviews or feuds meant to boost headlines. Reporters who spent time with him over the decades repeatedly emphasized this point. Leonard Cohen believed in quiet resistance. His critiques were often cloaked in metaphor, whispered in late-night conversations, or left unsaid altogether, only traceable through his lyrics, his choice of collaborators, and the emotional temperature of his work. It wasn't because he lacked opinions. On the contrary, he had many, but because he saw public condemnation as a violation of artistic dignity, both his and others. In a taped interview from 1992, which was never broadcast in full, but recounted by a veteran BBC journalist, Cohen was asked whether he considered himself more authentic than the mainstream pop acts dominating the charts. He paused, smiled gently, and said, "I don't compare. I just continue." That ethos defined him. Not because he was indifferent, but because he understood the futility of throwing stones at an industry built on mirrors. He knew that time was the only fair critic. His silence was not absence, it was his statement. When asked why he didn't call out what he clearly disagreed with, mass-market anthems, shallow lyricism, performance over presence, he would often reference an old Jewish proverb: a wise man hears one word and understands two. In other words, his fans would know. They would sense his disapproval not in insults, but in the integrity of his work. He chose his silence carefully, as if aware that to publicly attack another artist, even one he didn't respect, would risk diluting his own message with noise. Instead, he spent his life writing songs that quietly rebelled against the very things he disliked: superficiality, arrogance, artificial optimism. If he couldn't teach through critique, he would teach through contrast. This restraint was not weakness, it was discipline, forged from years of spiritual inquiry and poetic rigor. In the end, Leonard Cohen didn't need to declare war on the bands he disliked. He simply chose not to follow their path, trusting that those who listened closely would hear what he didn't say. Then perhaps, in a world saturated with shouting, his silence became the loudest rejection of all.